Welcome into the season recap episode of the Musketeer Report Podcast. Paul Fritschner and Rick Broering with you here on March 26th. Xavier finishes the season 16-18 overall, their first losing season since 1995-1996. We know the streak, so we've talked about it over the last couple of weeks. One of only 6 teams that had a streak like that, only 5 teams a streak longer, but the streak is broken this year. Xavier finished 9-11 in Big East play, and now here we are a week removed from the season after Xavier lost to Georgia in the first round of the NIT, a game that Xavier was losing by 20-plus at one point. They come all the way back. They have a chance to tie or take the lead on the last possession of the game. Didn't happen. The season's over, and now we are in to the portal part of the offseason as we record this a few days before the Sweet 16 gets going in the NCAA tournament. As of right now, where we stand, we already know that Abu Usman, Kachi Enze, Sasha Chiani, and Cam Kraft have entered the transfer portal. Davion McKnight, thanks to our guy KY Muskie, procured that information on Twitter. Found out that Davion McKnight will indeed be coming back next year. And Rick, I'm going to start it off to you. I saw somebody else asking on Twitter, would it be more efficient time-wise to find out the people that are coming back and just assume everybody's going in the portal instead of vice versa where we are right now?
Well, I mean, that's not how it works, though, right? Like, yeah, I mean, all the fans want this to work for them, and that's not really what's going on here. These guys are making actual decisions about their lives. It's not predetermined what they're going to do necessarily. So there are some actual decisions. I think what you've seen early on here is the guys that kind of had their mind made up. They knew what was going on. They've already announced their decision, and there are a few guys now that we still are a little bit unsure about. And I think for those guys, there was a decision that had to be made still, and they're figuring out what's next for them. So I do think there'll at least be a few more guys that will enter the portal. There are a couple guys that we still have questions about. We're not sure where it stands. So we'll get into more of the portal discussion later, but let's get back to the season recap.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing that I would ask you, Rick, and just as an overall takeaway from the season, I don't want this to sound negative, but I'm going to ask it. Is there anything to take away from this season?
I think my takeaway was that it was a frustrating year because even when you had the season-ending injuries or losses to Jerome Hunter and Zach Freemantle, I think then the staff kind of rallied through the international ranks and recruiting and added some more guys, and we were left with a team that I had a feeling wasn't going to be a great team, but I thought there was going to be so much fun development to watch as the season went on. You had all these freshmen. You had the interesting angle of the new international players being added to the mix. And it was like, all right, even if this is a bad year in terms of wins and losses, it feels like there are going to be so many new guys to talk about and look forward to as they develop and make progress towards next year. And I think that's where the frustration really set in from my perspective. And I would think for a lot of fans is that you really didn't get to see a lot of those young guys or new faces develop and gain some traction throughout the season. I mean, I think really Dalen Swain did. I think that's the one young guy that kind of we saw some progress and really saw some development. But for everybody else, I mean, there were flashes, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about Lazar and his minutes at the end of the season that were a little bit better. But for the most part, it just never felt like any of the young guys really started to make that jump and develop to where we'd be excited about what's going into next year with all those guys. Instead, it kind of feels like we got to the end of the season and now you kind of have to rebuild all of this and redo most of it again.
Yeah, and I think when you look at, from my perspective, obviously you have Quincy Oliveri, which I would say from a fan's perspective and trying to latch onto something and something that in 10 to 15 years, what will you remember about 2023, 2024? He's the first thing that's going to come to mind. Somebody that broke the all-time record for three-pointers made in a season. It was electrifying both on the court and off the court for Xavier, and somebody that a lot of people were able to, follow, latch on to through the season and really get to know, because I think that was one of my frustrations as the season went on and looking at the portal and everything else and realizing the landscape of college basketball is realizing that it's easy for us because we're there at practice every day. You get to know these guys. You're following along, every detail about everything that's happening on a day-to-day basis with this team. But for the general casual fan that's popping in and out of the NFL and popping in and out of watching Xavier and following along and watching the games and then maybe forgets about it till the next game, you don't have that continuity. You don't have that base that you're able to build on year after year after year because it's a new team. And I think that's the one thing that I know people are probably frustrated about. And I actually talked to somebody about this last night that said it was so hard for me all year that by the time I felt like I finally knew the team, now I'm realizing everybody's going to be gone by next year. And not everybody. I think that's a little dramatic to say on my part, because obviously we know there are a lot of key pieces to this team that are going to be coming back. But at the same time, there are the guys that we've already talked about that have entered the transfer portal. I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume that there are going to be more announcements about the portal forthcoming, whether that's one or several, I don't know. But I would assume we're not done hearing about the transfer portal. So from that perspective, trying to think of something to remember from 23-24, I would say Quincy Oliveri is definitely the specific thing that people will remember. But also, I'm curious to see, Rick, how this coaching staff learns from this year, right? You had the two injuries. You had Jerome Hunter and Zach Fremantle, so you immediately go the international route. My question is the coaching staff more reluctant now to go the international route because of what happened this year? But on the flip side of that, you've seen Sean have so much success over the years. Lauri Markkanen, Ristich, all these guys. I could go down the list of guys that he has coached as far as international players go. So I don't want to say that he's writing it off, but to have an experience like this in an emergency situation, I'm really curious to see how they attack it going forward.
I definitely don't think it will change their mindset in terms of recruiting internationally. I mean, even just right now, looking at some of the guys that they're interested in for the next few years, there are definitely going to be international names that we are talking about. And David Miller, Adam Cohen, they're so well connected in the NBA academies that are the international academies where you find a lot of these talented players from overseas. So Xavier is going to continue to recruit those types of players, Paul. But I think the big point of emphasis is that those guys were added kind of last minute after they were in an emergency mode because of the Jerome and Zach Fremantle announcements that they had to scramble a bit. And that's kind of, no offense to those guys, that's what was left at that point. So those weren't guys like they had been recruiting for years and landed just like they would a high school recruit, right? It was guys that they kind of scrambled, found at the last minute and added. I think the bigger lesson to be learned there, if there is a lesson, and maybe the lesson is just like, yeah, if you lose players at the last minute, it's going to be really hard to put together a roster with the way things are done now. But if anything, I think it might be, how much do you commit to guys at the last minute? In other words, they really had to do a lot of work there at the end to get those guys into school, to pay for the NILs, to work around the NIL stuff, because these are international recruits. All the work that went into getting those guys in and on campus and into your team. And then once they're here, now you're trying to slow everything down because there's a little bit of a language barrier and all of that, where you have to get those guys up to speed. Was all of that worth it? Or would it have been better to just literally grab any warm body who was already here in America and just go forth of like, hey, this is going to be a tough year? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there's a lesson to be learned there, but that would be my big question when you're talking about things to be learned from this year. I think that's where my mind goes of like, how was it worth it to go through all that trouble right at the last minute to get guys that, let's face it, two of them are already in the transfer portal, and the third one we don't expect to be a big contributor next year either.
Well, and the other thing, too, looking at the Big East, it's hard to even think about what you learned from this year's Big East because it was so top heavy. It's not like, and you have no idea the talent that could return. There is a chance where all of the top talent from the Big East comes back next year. I mean, you think about some of the biggest names in the Big East, pretty much all of them have the opportunity to come back. Marquette can return almost their entire team next year if they want to. Now, will they? Probably not, but they could. Even Tyler Kolek has another year if he wants to. David Joplin, Oso Ighodaro, all these guys can come back. So when you look at what they were trying to do this year, compete in the Big East, it was always going to be tough without two of your best players. It's hard to even compare what you can do next year in the Big East to, well, we had this year, but all three Big East teams are still playing. You got to wait a week to see what it's not like you're planning around what the other Big East teams are doing, but to an extent, you have a much better idea of where you're sitting in the in the conference projections 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, when guys have made their decisions on whether they're staying or going.
Yeah, one other thing that I would look at is kind of, I don't know if it's a lesson, but I'd be curious to know what the staff is thinking about roster building from a standpoint of how do you look at recruiting bigs versus guards going forward? Because I think if you go back to like big men transfers, we're talking about like, yeah, Jack Nungy was great. Zach Hankins was great for Xavier. There have been some really good big man transfers, but those were mostly before, or not mostly, they were definitely before the new transfer portal era kind of set in, right? Things have changed all of a sudden with guys being able to enter the portal every year, guys being able to transfer multiple times. All that stuff has changed a little bit. And one thing that I think we've seen is Xavier back-to-back years now has done a really good job of finding guards that are good enough to transfer up from the mid-major level and compete at the Big East level and really carry your team. I mean, Sule Boom and Quincy Oliveri did it in back-to-back years, and even Davion McKnight did a great job. I mean, it took him a little bit longer, I think, to get going, but once he got going, I think everyone was pretty pleased with the way Davion McKnight was performing by the end of the year. So I wonder, when you look at the front court situation, though, it wasn't as clear-cut. It was a little bit more confusing because you had, in theory, Zach Freemantle, Jerome Hunter returning. Then all of a sudden you lost them after the transfer portal had already closed. So that obviously complicated things for Xavier. But even just from an overall standpoint across the country, not looking specifically at Xavier, I think we're seeing that it is really difficult to find quality big men in the transfer portal. Even right now, when you look at all the people, all the players who have entered the portal right now, there are a lot of guards. There are a lot of good scorers. There are a lot of three-point shooters that you can find. There are not a lot of quality, high major talents that play in the front court that are available in the transfer portal right now, and everyone is looking for one. So I guess that would be another, and maybe this is more about the transfer portal conversation that we'll have here a little bit as we take some questions from the fans, but that would be another thing that I'm really curious about going forward is how do you look at recruiting certain positions in this new transfer portal era? Because it seems like everyone is focused on the way to rebuild your roster each year is going to be in the transfer portal, and I don't disagree with that, but there might be some other realities that we have to start looking at as we go forward.
Ron asks a question here. We can just get to this because it's a very quick answer. How are guys transferring multiple times? Don't you need a special waiver after the first time? That's gone. That injunction was, I guess, just for this championship season of 23-24, but it doesn't matter. The NCAA is not going to win anything against these players now. You can transfer as many times as you want. The two-time transfer regulation is gone. The NCAA basically has no power over transfers anymore. I'm not sure what power the NCAA has in general anymore, but the transfer issue is certainly not one of them.
Yeah, they did release another updated memo. They sent out a memo last year when they were in the midst of those court battles, and they essentially said all of the players that transferred multiple times were eligible immediately. They have updated that memo to say the court battles have not been settled, but any player that is in the transfer portal this year that transfers for a second time, they will be eligible to play 24-25 immediately, regardless of what the outcomes are with the court cases. And like you said, Paul, there's no chance they're actually going to win those court cases or continue to battle them. So we are looking at a situation where for the time being, we have unlimited free agency every year for college student athletes. It's going to be crazy.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. Paul, I wanted to ask you, because you guys just released, actually on Tuesday as we're recording this, the latest Sean Miller podcast episode you and Adam Baum did with him. And it was just you two talking with Coach basically about the season and about what's next. And I don't think there were a ton of specifics about what's next, but I do think you guys got into some good recapping of the season and how Sean saw things play out and talking about some of the guys that really led the team. We'll talk about the Dez thing in a minute because I want to get to that. I have a clip of that. But what else stood out to you from that conversation, if anything?
There was one thing that really stood out, and it was, to me, him talking about his plan when he was hired in 2022 and what he thought he was going to do with the program versus where he is now 2 years later, and how much that plan has changed because just the transfer portal era, the things you have to adapt to, what the college landscape is like right now, that you just have to blow up your plans and adapt. I thought that was really interesting because we all assume it, right? We all just know, you and I talk about it. We text everybody about it. You're tweeting about it, all this stuff. But to hear it come from a coach who's doing this day in and day out and realizing that, hey, this is the reality of the situation, that 2 years ago, when I stood up on that stage at the Cintas Center and I gave a speech about how happy I was to be back and here's what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and this and that, you're 2 years barely, I think, basically to the day, 2 years beyond from that. And it's completely changed. And to hear him go through that segment about, how he wants to attack this going forward, I thought that was pretty interesting.
I think that's a great point. And I that stood out to me too. And Paul, I couldn't help but think back to about a month or so ago when the Ohio State job first came open. And there were all the rumors about, look for Sean Miller to be a candidate for this job. People think Sean Miller might be looking to get out of Xavier and all of that. And a lot of the insider conversations, the rumors that were out there, centered around stuff like this. And you just wonder how much, when you're in the throes of a season, if maybe Sean had said something like this, what he said to you guys on that podcast, essentially, which is that the landscape, the plan for what I had to do at Xavier has completely changed since I got here. It's a totally different ballgame than what I was expecting when I came back. You wonder if maybe people heard that and ran with it a little bit too far, or maybe he just felt more strongly about it and how big of a deal it was at the time when he initially said that. And again, I'm totally just thinking here. This isn't stuff that I know to be true. This is just my thoughts on when I heard him say that on your podcast. I was like, sounds a lot like the type of stuff we were hearing when all those Ohio State rumors were being talked about. And you just wonder if this is kind of what led to all of that. And now that things have calmed down, the season's over, if Sean has been able to reflect on that a little bit more and said, yeah, things have changed, but we have a new plan of attack and we know how we're going to go about it.
Yeah, and then that's what they're doing right now in the transfer portal, and we've already seen that a couple of times, in the last few days. Guys going to take visits and everything, but we're going to get to that in a minute. The other thing that I think from the episode, just him highlighting the three players that he felt like were the three catalysts of this team this year, but two of them, and Davion McKnight and Desmond Claude, who both have the opportunity to come back next year. Davion McKnight has already said he's going to be coming back next year, and Desmond Claude, that's still up in the air. But hearing him start off the segment about Desmond Claude, and I know you have a clip about it, but hearing him talk about Des and potentially a shoulder issue that Des had to play through this season, and where he'd like
elbow.
Yes, elbow. My bad, elbow. I'm no doctor, Rick. Elbow issue that he was trying to play through this season, and some of these things that you're hearing him say about improvement. It was very catching to me to hear him talk so clearly and defined about Des like that.
Well, I mean, let's have the conversation that everyone wants to have. I mean, it's notable because it kind of felt like it was sort of a nod or maybe a push or something that suggested they feel pretty good about Des being back next year, right? I mean, it feels like you don't necessarily make these comments unless you're either trying to push that narrative along or because you feel good about it already. At least that would be my take.
Yeah. Do you have the clip before we?
About Des is he played with an elbow situation, which he's going to have to get cleaned out here after the year. And, I admire him for being able to do it every day. He didn't miss practices. He didn't miss games. He didn't hurt himself any further, but I think it bothered him throughout the year. And I have no doubt that could have impacted his ability to shoot the three. But he's going to make that jump. There's no doubt in my mind. And when he does, I think he then takes one more step, similar to Colby Jones, when you compare Colby as a sophomore to what he became as a junior. And certainly looking forward to that.
Was that with his elbow? Was that something that happened before the season, or was it?
I think it's just more of a wearing down effect throughout the year, and it's it's nothing significant, but when it bothers you, it bothers you, and yeah. I think that Des, just didn't say a lot about it, and worked hard every day in practice, worked hard obviously throughout the year, but that was a factor I think in his shooting percentage. But it was great to see him have the last game that he did, because sometimes when you get going a certain way and the ball's not going in, you can lose your confidence. And I think for most of the year, that was not a problem for him. He was able to get to the basket, score the ball. And again, I point to his free throw shooting. If you remember him last year in the NCAA tournament, I think it was against Pitt where they were fouling on purpose and he went to the line in multiple trips. He didn't look confident. If you look at his overall free throw shooting percentage as a freshman, it was not good. But this year, he became one of the Big East really most consistent and best free throw shooters. He shot right around 80%. So that huge jump that he made, oftentimes, as I've seen, it follows from behind the arc. And I have no doubt with his work ethic and love of the game that adding that, then, you know, his future is incredibly bright.
So there you go. Those were the comments from Sean Miller about Dez's elbow injury or issue that he was dealing with. And Paul, I mean, I know a lot of people are probably going to hear that and be like, oh, we're making excuses for a guy who struggled to shoot the three. But I would say the two things that you have to agree with are that, one, a lot of times when you see a guy shoot a really high percentage from the free throw line, typically they are at least decent 3-point shooter. And two, the Desmond's form does not look like a bad shooter's form. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be a great 3-point shooter, but it looks like he should shoot a better percentage. You don't typically see a guy who's a 20% 3-point shooter go out and hit 5 3-pointers in an NIT game like he did. You know, you don't see a guy go 5 for 6 like that if they're a terrible 3-point shooter. So you do have to wonder. One, I think his percentage was dragged down by how many tough shots he was forced to take within this offense, trying to bail the team out in a bad possession. And then two, you do wonder how much this affected his shooting. And I'm not saying it was all to blame, but I mean, the fact that Sean is pointing it out like this, you have to at least talk about it. I think it's something that's fairly legitimate.
I do too. And I think that combined with the mental aspect of, I forget when it was, I want to say it was in Vegas. It may have been at Cintas, but it was early in the season, November. He banked in a 3 and it was an ugly shot. He banked it in though. It went in, but it felt like from there, it was almost like he had the yips. And that combined with whatever this elbow issue may have been, I just wonder if all of that, it was a lot for him to overcome, plus the pressure of trying to be the best player on the team and all of this that, I mean, everybody had talked about going into the year with him and his talent level. It just feels to me like, if I just keep coming back to the fact that in his best game of the year, he scored 36 points against Georgetown and took 1 3. And every time I come back to that, I think to myself, what would he be like if he had Jerome Hunter and Zach Fremantle out there alleviating the pressure that he had to feel on the perimeter when he's being guarded by the other team's potentially best defender every single game? If you take that pressure off of Dez because they have to go guard somebody else or they have to trap down low and open up Dez on the perimeter, that completely changes the dynamic of what Dez is able to do outside and at least in my mind, take some pressure off of him shooting the 3.
Well, or just think about the pick and roll game, right? I mean, if you have a real threat as the roller, and we know how often Xavier wants to hit that guy, the roller, Paul.
The roller.
Right. I mean, you have no threat this year to throw that ball into on the roll. It now becomes real easy. Just put 2 on the ball, or maybe you're not putting 2 on the ball, but really all your focus is still on Desmond Claude trying to drive and create something in the mid-range or get to the rim. The one thing when you point out that Georgetown game where he scored all those points and only took 1 3, that it is like some of this, that should be telling to him. Some of this should be a mindset thing for him that like when you decide I'm not going to be denied, like you cannot stop me from getting into the lane and getting to my spots, you are a hellion to deal with from a defender standpoint. It is impossible. When you settle for tough jumpers, you are way easier to guard. Now, some of that is how good a team is defensively, what type of game plan they have for Dez, all of that. But some of it is also the type of mindset that he was playing with. So I think that he definitely has to make strides. He definitely has to improve. But I am curious to see what next year looks like for him because he made a big jump. Now we find out he was dealing with this elbow thing. It feels like there's a lot of upside for Desmond Claude still.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Anything else there from the podcast, Rick?
I just think, not necessarily from the podcast, but when I look forward to wrap this segment up, what can you build off of from this year's team? It's probably not as much as you wanted it to be from a Xavier fan's perspective. Like, I think you wanted to be talking about, look at this young front court with Lazar and Sasha and Kashi, and now you've got Dalen and Trey Green ready to take over the backcourt and all this stuff. That didn't quite happen, but I do think you have the 3D still. You got Dez, like we just talked about. Hopefully, we'll see what happens, but it seems like it's progressing in a positive manner for Xavier for him to be back next year, and it seems like there's a lot of upside still there for him. Davion McKnight has already said that he's going to be back. He made major strides towards the end of the year, and I think everyone's excited to see what he brings next year. And then Dalen. Dalen was the one freshman who I think really impressed and really looked like he has star potential going forward, and he's already starting to tap into that a little bit as we got into the later parts of the Big East season. So that's what I'd be looking for in terms of going forward. What do you take from this year? What can you build on? It's those three guys.
I agree. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the portal. Kachi, Cam, Sasha, Abu. Any of the surprises out of the four of those? To me, no, but Rick, to you.
I wasn't surprised by any of them. I think the most surprising part of the transfer portal so far was that all three of Kachi, Sasha, and Abu were in there so quickly. I think if you would have told me beforehand, I would have thought there would have been either one of those guys staying, or at least there would have been a more extended conversation and thought process around, is one of these guys going to stick around? And maybe it was all of them kind of being told, like, here's what your role is coming back next year. And they were like, no, thanks. I want nothing to do with that role. So I'm not exactly sure how those conversations played out, but that was the only slightly surprising part, is that all three of those big men were in pretty much right away. And, it seems that there is at least a very serious conversation around what Lazar is going to do, if not him coming back next year. So that is another part that I think, had you asked us maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago, we might have had a very different answer on which of these big guys, which of these front court players were most likely to come back. But as of today, it would seem that Lazar is the guy.
I remember sending a text to Adam about 4 games left in the season, and I said over under 8.5 minutes we see out of Lazar the rest of the season. And then he goes and plays 33 minutes in consecutive games, and he and I were just looking at each other going, whoa, didn't necessarily expect this, except that you could tell they were trying to get him out there, get him some experience. And at that point in the season too, I mean, if you look back at the schedule and what happened in February and how this season really went down, you look back at the Creighton game, that's to me where the season really turned, because at that point, Xavier was 13-10. They were 7-5 in the Big East. They were coming off that win over Villanova. They had all this momentum. They had like a 64% chance to make the tournament. They were looking at probably a 10 seed, maybe a 9 seed at that point, assuming that the rest of the schedule played out at that point the way we thought it would. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, you beat Creighton at home. You got the whole world in front of you to at least make the tournament. I'm not saying they're going to make the Sweet 16, but at least they're going to get a bid. They're going to get in the tournament, and maybe you steal a game in the 8-9 game or something like that. But they get effectively blown out by Creighton at home. I know they rallied in the end, and it made it a 7-point game. But then they got completely blown out against Seton Hall, lose to Providence at home, no doubter against Marquette on the road. That 4-game losing streak, that was what really broke the season at Creighton, and I think against Creighton at home. And my point in all of this, to tie it back to Lazar, is you knew by the end of the year you were going to have to win the Big East tournament to get in the NCAA tournament. And at that point, why not give Kachi, why not give Lazar some minutes and see what you have out of them? Now, I know Kachi's already made his decision to go to the portal. If Lazar was more aggressive getting to the rim, or could at least finish when he got to the rim, because there were times the NIT game and in a couple of those last games where he'd get to the rim, he'd do everything right, and the ball just wouldn't go in. You translate some of that, and he took some strides. And I think at the beginning of the year, he had put so much pressure on himself to have this crazy year, and everybody was talking about it, kind of similar to the Dez situation, where he's the most hyped freshman in this class. He's getting nobody really knew about him. It's this mystery figure coming from overseas that's going to save the season. It doesn't pan out like that. So the coaching staff has to kind of break him down and then build him back up again. And that's what you saw there at the end of the year.
Yeah, I think Lazar's expectations really hurt his overall season. I think it made everything a little out of whack before the year. I mean, there was the talk about him being potentially one and done, talk about he was going to be a starter for this team before he injured his finger at the beginning of the year and all that. And then he came back and he really struggled to handle the physicality and keep up on the defensive end, much less kind of get into the flow and start feeling himself on offense. And he kind of lost favor with the staff. And then the really interesting part is, Paul, I mean, it's not that he wasn't getting minutes late in the year, that little stretch that you were talking about. he was benched. I mean, he went from playing some minutes to he didn't see the floor for at least 2 games, maybe 3 right there at the end of the year. And then all of a sudden he's back to playing 33 minutes again at the end of the year. So it seemed like something clearly happened. There was some type of misunderstanding, or his body language or his attitude or something wasn't the way it needed to be. He got it back on track. And like you said, at that point, the season is in a spot where you're like, you have to win the Big East tournament to even have a chance at going to the NCAA tournament anyways. So what do you have to lose by playing him? And then all of a sudden he gets 33 minutes. And he even made a comment in one of the opportunities he got to talk where he was interviewed, where he said something to the effect of, I didn't have the right mindset, or something along those lines. So it felt very much like there was a come to Jesus meeting or some type of conversation with him and the coaching staff that got him kind of on the right track. And so I'm really excited to see what his offseason looks like if he sticks around. And like we said, I think the way things are trending, it feels like more likely he will be around next year.
Yeah, so this was after the Butler game in the Big East tournament. He said to Shelby Dermer, the beat reporter for the Enquirer, Lazar said, quote, "To be honest, I wasn't great at the beginning of the season. My expectations were high. I lowered my expectations, worked hard in practice, and just played my role." And that was incredibly mature of him, and it made me realize that everything the coaching staff had been trying to instill in him and get him to believe, it had clicked through that quote.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It felt like that was not something he would have said a month prior had you asked him when he was in the process of getting benched. And then all of a sudden, like the light bulb went off or some type of conversation was had and his effort was good. They gave him the minutes. They were able to leave him on the court for 30 minutes a game. And, you started to see a little bit of progress, I think, of him being a productive player or moving at least in that direction. Now, he's got a long way to go before he is a Big East level starter, but he has the physical tools and the skill set to do it. He's just got to put a lot of that together. So he's going to be a big storyline for at least the next few days until we figure out what he's going to do officially.
Personally, I would love to see him back. I really do. I know people have some polarizing opinions of him. Some people say that they've seen enough. Some people say that they'd like to see him back. I am firmly in the I would like to see him back. I'd like to see him develop over the next couple of years with Xavier and see what you can do because, like you said, you have the physical tools, but can you put it together both mentally to prepare yourself to be physical in the Big East, but also build yourself up, the skill set, everything else to be a talented player? And I think he can. You just got to see if he sticks it out at Xavier or if he moves on elsewhere. All right. So we've talked about those 4. Davion McKnight, he did say on Twitter the other day he will be back. I don't think we need to spend too long on this because we've talked a lot about Davion, but just the significance of having a point guard now who was able to play so well. He finished, I believe, 2nd in the Big East this season in assist to turnover ratio, one of the best in the country at not turning over the basketball. And with how fast he plays, I thought that was really interesting when we had him on the show. And he was talking to Sean. He was talking about how you wouldn't think that playing fast, you'd be able to keep your turnovers low, but for some reason, that's how it works, and that's how he was able to play through the season or through the system this year.
He was asked to play in a completely new system with a totally different style of play from what he was used to. He was asked to take on a completely different role from being a gunner who played almost like a Kiki Tandy point guard type role where he's like the main focal point of the offense, even though he's bringing the ball up the floor, to being a setup man who's truly setting the table for his teammates and getting them involved first and foremost. And he's doing it all while playing at this rapid breakneck pace where the staff, I mean, Paul, you were at practice every day. It's like, faster. Come on, faster. Let's go. Let's go faster.
Speed.
I mean, yeah. I mean, like I see fans commenting sometimes, like I posted the story about Davion is going to be back. And I see a fan immediately comment like, he's just got to slow down and play a little bit more under control. It's like, that ain't going to happen. That is the exact opposite of what the coaching staff is telling him to do. So that is not on him. That he is being told to play as fast as humanly possible. And to do that while leading the conference in assist to turnover ratio, that stood out to me more than anything about his progress this year. And then I think towards the end of the year, you started to see the offensive-minded Davion mix with the new style of play Davion, where he's the table setter, because he started to have some big scoring games and he was shooting the ball much better. So I think next year you just have a guy who's way more comfortable and way more confident in the system, and that can only lead to good things.
How many more players do you think will leave, Rick? If I set the over under at 2.5, would you take the over or the under?
I think Man, that's a good question. I think over. And here's why I'd say that. And I don't have a strong opinion about any of the other guys leaving. Okay, so right now we're at 4. I said originally, when I think I did this podcast last week, I think I said it at 6, and then I bumped up on our message board to maybe 6.5 since then would be my over-under. We've got the 4 right now. I think Reed Ducharme and Gitas Nemesha are both likely to be somewhere else next year. I just don't see them being likely to be back. So that brings you up to 6. And then at that point, it becomes a conversation of like, we've heard the rumors about Dez. Is everything worked out there? Is he for sure back? Seems like it's moving in the right direction. We'll see. Same thing with Lazar. We've discussed that. Seems like things are moving in the direction for him to be back next year. But if you told me he went into the portal tomorrow, would I be surprised? No, not really. And then finally, probably there's 2 more guys. Trey Green is probably the other name that we've heard the most about. And the guy you've got 2 smallish point guards. Do they both feel like they have enough of a role? I don't know. I don't know what those conversations have been like since the season ended. So that would be another guy. And then I am optimistic about Zach Fremantle being back next year, but we have seen the rumors out there. I know Chili Donovan had posted it on his Discord that it could happen. And I've heard those rumors too. I don't think that's like bogus or anything, that, there could be something about Zach looking elsewhere. I don't think that will happen, but that's out there. So it wouldn't be a complete shock. So I guess the reason I would say over 6.5, even though I only feel like there are 6 guys leaving right now, is because there are 4 potential options that could still leave that we're unsure of. And we just haven't heard anything about them yet. So if one of them were to leave, it wouldn't be a complete surprise. The one guy that I would say would be a surprise at this point for me is Dalen Swain. I couldn't see him going anywhere.
That's the okay. I'm not even going to say anything more because that was what I was going to bring up. As far as the portal goes, Rick, what do you think the staff is going to prioritize over the next few weeks as they really gear up?
Yeah, so I talked about a little bit last week of sort of my general thoughts on what I thought they'd be after. I've talked to more people since then, gathered a little more intel. I think I get a little more specific now of what I think an ideal transfer portal would look like for Xavier. I think they'd bring in 2 big men, not 1, but 2. A skilled guy, more of a scorer that they were lacking this year, and then a guy that can really bolster the athleticism, the defense, and the rebounding of this front court. I think that's something that they're really going to value after last year. How many times did we hear Sean after a game in his post-game press conference talk about their lack of toughness on the defensive glass, Paul? I mean, it came up constantly, did it not?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be something that they're really focused on. So adding 2 big men ideally. Then from there, the other priority that I put right up there with it is finding a shooting guard to replace Quincy Oliveri. You've got to find a big-time scorer, and preferably one that is also an elite shooter from the outside, or at least a very good one, because that's what you're losing in Quincy Oliveri. And again, I've made the argument multiple times that I don't think they had enough shooting last year, even with Quincy on the team. So they definitely have to upgrade the shooting and the scoring on the perimeter there. Then after that, I think it gets a little bit more kind of looking for best guy available, looking for what you can get. But ideally, it's probably a combo forward from there and a combo guard. So I think that probably means like a hybrid guy that, if it's a shooter that can play like the 3-4 spot, that would probably be great. But maybe it's a supreme defender, an athlete that can play the 3 or the 4 and give you a little more defensive flexibility. I could see that. And then the combo guard spot, I think you're looking for a bigger guard, someone who's not 6 foot like Davion McKnight and Trey Green.
I got a bunch of questions on Twitter yesterday and my replies talking about the quote that Sean had in the podcast, and we published that little teaser video last night, and Sean made the comment, which I did think was kind of funny at the end, the way he finished it, but he said, I think the best transfer that we're going to have, or transfers that we're going to have available for next year's team, are going to start with Zach Fremantle and Jerome Hunter. God would not let them miss a single game next year, which I thought was funny, just after everything they've been through in their careers and the injuries and everything else. Hoping that everything works out, that they're able to play. But I also think, just reading the tea leaves of how they're approaching this portal, that they know whatever they get out of Zach and Jerome, they're going to be grateful for. But you can't count on both of them to be available for 25, 30 minutes a game for 35 games.
Yeah. And I think, Paul, the fans have to realize that there is a reality of Sean's going to say things publicly because those guys are coming back and he supports the hell out of them and he wants them to feel good about everything. He wants them to do really well. And there's also what Sean and his staff are doing behind the scenes and actually doing when it comes to building the roster. And those probably don't always line up exactly, right? I mean, he's saying those guys aren't going to miss a game, But I can guarantee you they are approaching this offseason as if they need insurance policies for both of those guys because they have a long road and there's just not a lot of certainty around what they're coming back from. So I get the hand wringing by the fans are like, oh no, Sean's talking about these guys not missing a game. He's penciling them in to be the starters again next year. And penciling maybe, but again, he's going to have a plan for if they're not available to give them 30 minutes a game. I can promise you that.
All right, let's talk about the two names. Although Josh Cohen, who is a UMass transfer, I think he canceled his visit to Xavier, didn't he?
Josh Cohen, I mentioned on the message board, he is not going to be visiting Xavier. He had set up visits for Arkansas, Notre Dame, and Xavier originally, and the Xavier visit has been canceled. I posted a little bit more about this on the message board. I don't think you'll see that rescheduled. I think he likely already has his options in Arkansas and Notre Dame, but that is the latest on Josh Cohen.
Okay, and then the other option right now, at least in the portal, Sam Alexis out of Chattanooga, big. Rick, what do you know about Sam Alexis?
Yeah, Sam Alexis is just another guy who
and if you're listening, if you're listening in podcast form, you can watch on YouTube. We're running the highlights right now. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I got some highlights of Alexis right here, so you can kind of see what he does offensively. He's another big guy that wants to visit Xavier. I don't think there's been any official date set yet for that visit, but they're definitely involved here, and this is a guy that I think they're going to definitely try for. He's athletic. He's more of a defensive-minded rebounder guy, but he can also score a little bit in the low post. One thing I like about his game is like he might catch a pick and pop and then drive you to the rim, uses athleticism to go around a slower defender. And there are some exciting things to see. I would say my favorite part about his game overall is the way he rebounds. You hear wide receiver conversations. They talk about high pointing the ball, Paul, going up and catching it at his highest point to get it over top of the defensive back. That's like how Sam Alexis rebounds. He goes up and he high points the ball. It's 3 feet above the rim and he's going up, arms extended, catching it with two hands out of his area. I love the way he rebounds. And given the way that Xavier struggled with that this past year, I would think that's something that'll stand out to the coaches on tape as well when they see him.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gone through extended game film or game footage of him, but from the little I've seen on YouTube or these clips, I think Xavier could do a whole lot worse than getting him to commit to Victory Parkway.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely what we were just talking about before applies here in the sense that big men, there's going to be a lot of competition for them. There's not a lot of quality big men available. So he's got a lot of schools that are going to be interested. I do think Xavier is one of the schools that's more in there than most. They have like a legitimate contact with them and everything already. So I think you'll see him come on a visit and then we'll go from there. But this is definitely one of the names early to keep an eye on.
Okay. Anything else in the portal? Any other names you've heard? Anything you expect out of the portal right now?
No other specific names, I wouldn't say, Paul, right now. Those are going, I mean, we're talking about them constantly on the message board in terms of guys that have popped up, but they're, in terms of guys that like are definitely going to visit or that they've got an obvious connection with, I wouldn't say there are any more specifics to add just yet.
One question I think people may be wondering, Rick, what is the pace of the portal? What can you expect over the next week, 2 weeks, month, 2 months?
That's a really good question, and something that I think there's a little strategy involved here probably, and you probably have different coaches viewing it different ways. One thing that I have heard this year from people around Xavier a little bit is that you might see them slow play initially some of the commitments. In other words, there's all these guys that jump in right away, and everyone's in a mad dash to pay them all the NIL money and come to their school. It seems like the competition is a little higher for some of the first guys in, and that means you're overpaying. It also means maybe you're battling it out with other big-time schools for a guy that isn't quite that level, and he's being over-recruited a little bit. So now you got to be very careful about this. It's a thin line to walk because you don't want to wait too long and all of a sudden you're left with no good options either. But I think, in terms of, I wouldn't panic too much if there's no commitment in the next week or so. I think there is a little bit of an art to this in terms of finding the right time to get in and make your move and offer your NIL money at that time. So it's I would say we're seeing a lot of names trickle in over the last 2 weeks. You'll continue to see that as the NCAA tournament gets wrapped up here. There are still teams that are finishing up their season, and it's not always that like these teams that are still playing are going to have a ton of guys leave necessarily, but you will start to see that like they'll have a better idea of what their roster looks like. So they'll start to grab guys out of the portal. That will open up other spots. It's a game of musical chairs a lot of times. So you're going to continue to see the next 2 weeks, a lot of guys go into the portal. And then from there, I think you'll really start to see the commitments happen a little bit faster over the next week and a half to 3 weeks.
We did have a question about Jonathan Powell, and that was one other note that we had here to talk about on the show. He came up a little short for an Ohio State championship. They lost to St. Ives by 10 up at UD Arena in the state title game last week, but he averaged almost 20 points per game this season. He shot a little over 46%. He was just under 40% from three, averaged 4 rebounds, little over an assist and a half per game, little under a steal and a half per game, and just about 2 turnovers. Do you expect anything out of Jonathan Powell next season?
I don't expect any freshman usually to play a big role for a team or for a team to rely on him. I know a lot of people are excited about Jonathan Powell because he's a volume 3-point shooter, and that's an exciting skill to have. I know Xavier definitely needs shooting on the wing, so he'll come in. I think he'll get that opportunity to compete for an immediate role. I wouldn't have high expectations of him playing a lot of minutes as a freshman.
I agree. I think anything you get out of Jonathan Powell next year would be it would be to Xavier's benefit, but I'm not expecting anything out of him just going into next year. And I think how they're potentially going to, attack the portal, get shooting, things like that. Let's see. Any other questions here that we have?
Yeah, Kenny Freed says, are the coaches that are in the tourney already working on the portal, or do they wait until they are officially done to open up that discussion? They're definitely already working the portal, especially as it relates to looking at the guys that are in the portal and trying to find who they need next and getting in contact with them. Now, it's a little bit different from knowing what their roster is going to look like. Most of these teams know, but there's always a surprise or two that happens after the season officially ends, or maybe even you change your mind as you start to see what's available in the portal. You say, we thought we were going to bring this guy back, but you know what? We can do better than him in the portal, so let's convince him to move on elsewhere. So there will be some changes for them with the guys that they have coming back or not, but definitely all of them are already going into the portal and trying to find guys and recruiting as much as they can while also focusing on the task at hand. But it really sucks now that you have to be playing for the thing that everyone is working towards all season long, working towards an NCAA championship, and yet you're also now making the most important decisions of your offseason for next year's roster. It's a shame of the current situation of college basketball.
Who was it? Saban? Was it Saban that said he was pissed off they made the title game because he couldn't recruit? This was years ago that he said they made the title game and he was pissed off because he was losing out on time to recruit.
Yeah, I do remember.
You remember that quote, or was that in the NFL? Was it Belichick talking about? No, it wouldn't have been free agency. I don't know who it was, but it was one of the two of them. Yeah.
I do remember that, and it's like really what we've created for all of these coaches. Like it's not even that they want it to be like that, but it's the reality. You have to start recruiting the transfer portal as soon as it opens.
I will say I think it's ridiculous that the portal opens the day after the season ends as far as Selection Sunday. I think that's ridiculous. I do think you can push it back a week because after a week, there's only 24 teams still remaining. There's the 16 teams in the NCAA tournament, and there's 8 teams left in the NIT. Well, I guess there's the CBI too. How could we forget the CBI? But you're talking about less than 30 teams. You're talking about less than 10% of the sport still playing. But when you're last week, you have 68 teams in the NCAA tournament. You have 32 teams you're talking about almost a third of the sport that is still playing, maybe over a third of the sport that is still playing. You got to at least push it back. The portal should have opened today, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, I mean, it's not like it makes it any better for the teams that are still playing right now. I mean, if you're in the Sweet 16 and the portal opens today, it's just as crazy for you then. And it's arguably you're at a more important part of the tournament because you're now in the second weekend and you got a chance at an Elite Eight, a Final Four, all that stuff. So there's really no good time to do it, I guess, in terms of while the season is still going on. I don't know what the right answer for that is. it kind of sucks the way it's set up right now. I got to be honest.
I think it should be the Tuesday after the national championship game, but if we got to do something, we got to at least push it till yesterday.
Could you imagine that if all these teams that like their season ended after their conference tournament, then they had to wait over basically a month, right? Or 3 weeks.
Yeah, but we wouldn't have to listen to everybody complaining about ditching the NIT because there would be it would incentivize postseason play.
Well, I'm telling you right now, you are going to see guys that start jumping in the portal before the NCAA tournament. Their team will be in the NCAA tournament and they'll be like, I don't play a huge role on this team, or they screwed me on my NIL payment or whatever. I'm out. See ya. I'm transferring now. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. I see Jimmy.
Yeah, we're good. We're good. We're good on all. We're good on that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Let's see. Big East performance in the NCAA tournament. Yeah. 6-0. All three teams that made it are into the Sweet 16. No upsets. UConn just as dominant as ever. Marquette survived a scare against Colorado, and Creighton, maybe the best game of the weekend, into double overtime. They're down 4 in the last minute of that game. They survive. They move on to the Sweet 16. I think in terms of the path to the Final Four, UConn's obviously the easiest, or at least have the best chance. Then I would go Marquette. You have the 11 seed NC State, and then potentially either who would that be on the other side, Houston or Duke. But then Creighton, I think, to me, they have a tall task there with Dalton Connect and Tennessee. Not only that, but then you would have to probably play Purdue in the Elite Eight. So for me to get to the Final Four, it's like UConn, Marquette maybe here, and then Creighton
way down.
A very significant step down. Because if you think last year, Xavier in Texas, Xavier was a 3 seed playing the 2 seed in Texas. And remember how, just to put it quite frankly, how overmatched it felt like Xavier was in that game against Texas. I don't want to say that Creighton's going to be overmatched in this game, maybe to that extent, but at the same time, Tennessee has been really, really good for a lot of this season.
Yeah.
Not to say Creighton hasn't, but
that'll be a fun game, I think. But Tennessee is they're tough defensively. They have an elite killer scorer. They're efficient offense. This Tennessee team is very good. So that's a tough game, and I think a tough matchup. But Marquette's the one. I think Marquette has a pretty decent draw for what they're going for. You're to the point where you can lose to anybody, but I would not be surprised to see them make that run.
That's true. Yeah, I'll be down there in Dallas. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm excited for it, going down there with Marquette. So we'll see.
Yeah, I also think I don't get too caught up in the Big East teams had success, so that means not enough Big East teams got into the tournament, right? Because that can cut both ways. And I also think the top teams in the Big East, they got into the tournament, and they were clearly the best teams in the Big East this year. There was a big drop off, I think, to the middle of the pack. So I don't know. I also think that everyone talks about how bad the tournament committee was. It's a pretty chalky tournament, so it seems like they did a pretty good job of picking the seeds, right?
Yeah, my argument with the Big East would have been one more team. I think they should have had 4. I don't think they
Virginia,
should have had...
and everyone had the argument that they should have been over Virginia.
Yeah,
every team
exactly.
that missed. So it's just that's kind of where I left it.
But you make a great point, Rick. 13 of the top 14 Ken Pom teams are in the Sweet 16. 15 of the 16 Sweet 16 teams are top 23 on Ken Pom, and the outlier is NC State, who's sitting there at 53, but they've won 7 games in a row, and after going 5 games in 5 days, they still had the energy to go out there and win 2 games in the NCAA tournament this week. So, yeah.
Bad day for the Ken Pom haters. Bad day for the analytics haters.
Bad day if you hate the numbers. Yeah. Anything else? Cam Kraft going to play for Travis Steele at Miami.
Yeah, Cam Kraft committed. We just saw that come across today. Max chime in with that. So that seems like a perfect fit. That's who he was originally recruited to play for. Travis definitely is a little bit more offensive minded, and he's not going to be asked to do the same things defensively that he was at Xavier.
I will be very interested, Rick, to see how he does at Miami, because I thought he put a lot of pressure on himself when he was in the game at Xavier, and he looked like a completely different player than what they had recruited. When they recruited him, he was this uber confident shooter who had a stellar AAU career, a stellar high school career. And that was not the player that showed up at Xavier. But there were times in practice where I'm sitting there going, man, if only he was able to do that in a game. And now I'll be very interested to see if some of that was just I gotta see the ball go through, and maybe now I gotta go do it at the MAC level.
I think the pressure thing, Paul, is a real one with this, because it was like when he said that he was redshirting and there was no more, I was like, I'm not going to play anymore. You're right. In practice, he was a different player. And it's like, how could this, I mean, this guy would definitely help the team right now if he was not redshirting and he was available. So I don't know what to think of where he would be if he stayed at the high major level, but him transferring down to the MAC, I mean, I think he could be like one of the leading scorers in the conference at that level.
The day that he redshirted, the next, and I feel comfortable talking about this now because the season is over. He's no longer at Xavier. The day that he said that he was redshirting, the next week of practices, how many times did you and me and Adam and Shelby look at each other and go, where has this guy been?
Yeah, and it was always like, we kept doing you sure you're redshirting thing? Like, you sure you want to do that? Because you would play.
Yeah. And he was the player in practice that we thought you were going to get on the court. That Cam Kraft would have contributed at a very high level. It's just for whatever reason. And look, he's a 18 to 22-year-old college basketball player, and that happens. It's a real thing. It's a shame that it didn't work out at Xavier, but I really hope that it works out for him at Miami, because there's a lot of talent in there. He's a very good shooter, and hopefully it works out for him and Travis. Nothing but the best to Cam.
Yeah. Could you see any guys from X who went into the portal end up coming back like Kiki did a few years ago? Not any of the current guys.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I mean, now maybe if there's someone else that goes in the portal, maybe we'll change our stance on that. I don't know. It'd be a different situation. Then we'd have to find out what's going on. But currently with the guys that are in the portal, no, I don't see that happening at all. One last question to wrap it up here from Minger. Says, heard anything about Big East expansion? That's played above our level for the most part. I don't have a lot of presidents of universities that I talk to and heads of TV corporations and things like that. I mean, I really know nothing about it.
Yeah, but the TV contract has one more year. The one interesting thing about the whole TV contract that I saw, that I read the other, last week, whatever, when it came out, was the Flow Sports contract for the Big East, which is how you watch all the games. If you ever want to listen to Paul Fritschner doing a game, it's always through Flow Sports, but don't worry, you have to pay $1 million a month to watch it. And the website is,
and the stream will never work, but
and quite possibly the hardest website to navigate in the world. But when you talk about the Big East contract, and they're partnered with Fox, they're partnered with CBS, but also I think it's going to be really intriguing to see what kind of a streaming option. And I've talked about this before here on the show, but I think it's very legitimate too, because the Flow Sports contract is going to come up at the same time. I'm wondering if whatever streaming partner the Big East partners with, whether that's an ESPN Plus or whether that's whoever it is, if they turn to some of the non-conference games going to a streaming option. And I know nobody wants to hear it, but I think it's just the reality of the situation that in 25, 26, I wouldn't be shocked to see Xavier and Robert Morris go to, an ESPN Plus or something like that, because that's just the day and age where we are.
Yeah, it seems like every conference is signing deals that involve a streaming component to go with it. Because first of all, they want a streaming platform. They want some type of contract with a streaming platform, whether it's their own or they've got to deal with somebody else. So I don't think you're going to see that go away anytime soon. You're dead on, Paul.
Last question here. Brad Colbert is the other one, was in the portal. Brad has said that he wants to go play somewhere else, D2, D3, but no idea where he would end up.
Yeah,
that's all.
Thomas More or something.
Yeah.
All right.
Rick, anything else? News, notes, nuggets? The floor is yours.
That's it. MusketeerReport.com. We'll have tons of transfer portal news on there, and keep it locked. So we'll talk to you soon.
See you.